only one Toronto newscast can prepare you for the future. Hillary Brown and the CBC at 6. News for the 90s.
The transportation needs of Canadians with disabilities have long been neglected. Getting about town and country remain a principal barrier to full integration. But help is said to be on the way at last.
Hello and welcome to another edition of DNet, the Disability Network. I'm Joe Coughlin.
And I'm Susan Pettit. The traveling needs of people with disabilities have received little attention from the transport industry and government regulators. Trains, planes, and buses, the terminals they operate from, confront mobility-impaired travelers with endless physical barriers. Experts agree that the full integration of people with disabilities will not happen until our transportation system is radically reformed. Doug Lewis, the Minister of Transport for Canada, stated during National Transportation Week that he's prepared to solve many of these outstanding problems. Joe spoke with Lewis earlier.
Mr. Lewis, in a recent speech that you gave honoring National Transportation Week, you stated that you were committed to making accessible transportation an important focus of your goals as Minister of Transportation. What specific plans do you have to improve transportation for the disabled traveler?
Well, I think we've made a lot of progress over the past few years, and through the Committee on Accessible Transportation that has been set up, through the focus that we're putting on accessible transportation in Transport Canada, my trips through airports and ports, I've tried to ask the management people who show me around what steps they've taken recently to help disabled travelers. I think through those matters, we are going to put a focus on it. And by that I mean I have to go out to business groups and other organizations and tell them that it's a concern of mine and my government's that nobody be left behind in terms of transportation.
Via Rail was the only truly accessible form of transportation for people with disabilities in the country. When the federal budget slashed 50% of Via Rail funding, effectively half of the accessible transportation was removed from people with disabilities in the country. What can we expect to replace this in the future?
Well, now, two things should be remembered here. Number one, the Via Rail cuts were to the number of trips, and not all the routes were cut, and obviously there's a very viable transportation system left. Secondly, all the while we're financing and subsidizing every trip to the tune of $100 per trip per passenger. That takes away from money that's available to make improvements in the Via Rail that we have, in bus transportation, in other modes of transportation. What we're trying to do is use our money as effectively as possible, and the Via Rail cuts were made to routes and to trips that just weren't viable.
Mr. Lewis, I want to thank you for joining us on the program.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Joining Joe now is David Baker. He's the Executive Director of the Advocacy Resource Centre for the Handicapped, ARCH.
Mr. Baker, Mr. Lewis said that we're making significant progress when it comes to people with disabilities traveling in the country. What's your reaction to that statement?
I think Mr. Lewis is new in the portfolio and needs to be better briefed. His government has cut $250 million out of the budget for making airports accessible. With deregulation, all the guarantees and benefits that disabled people have won over the last 20 years have been lost. The regulations which have been promised have been sitting in the Privy Council office for a year and a half, and we're told it will be another year or two before they see the light of day, at best. Think of Via Rail cuts. There are disabled people across this country who are now trapped in those communities. They were dependent upon the train as the only means for getting out. Now the train is gone. And I look at the Americans. They've developed accessible buses. The guarantee is that every bus in the United States will be accessible. Nothing at all, no action in this country on the issue of accessible bus.
Mr. Baker, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Last week, we did a story on a group of disabled people who said they would not be celebrating National Transportation Day, a part of National Access Awareness Week. In the course of an interview, John Feld of Arch, the Advocacy Resource Center for the Handicapped, stated that he considered the just concluded week to be a crock, concocted by the federal government to pat themselves on the back for the efforts they've made in assisting people with disabilities. We received a fax on Monday from Kim Miller, who is the provincial coordinator for Access Awareness Week in Ontario. She says to dismiss the week entirely by summing it up as a crock is a gross and inaccurate oversimplification of the true substance and spirit of the week. I feel that a balanced perspective is a responsibility of any reporting mechanism. Kim Miller will be joining me in a moment. We took an informal poll of representatives of disability organizations throughout the community. Here's what they had to say. Some members of the disabled community say Access Awareness Week makes them feel they have to be super people. It's the Rick Hansen syndrome. They can't or don't want to be super people. This role model is hard to live up to. On the positive side, sometimes it does enhance the awareness of people with disabilities. I have told funders personally that my impression through the years is there are some who believe that the money spent could be better spent in the community, in other programs, or in support through the funding of a project at the community level. That's from Joyce Main, president of Boost.
It's an opportunity to present positives and negatives within the community. I would like to see resources going into the week go to consumer groups. Dick Santos, provincial coordinator, PUSH.
Having sat on the Ontario Steering Committee for Access Awareness Week, I found this to be an invaluable experience, to learn and appreciate each other's needs. This is very important before you project it into the community. Various disabled groups hadn't thought about each other's disabilities before this. That's from Ann Orr, CNIB, Ontario Director of Communications.
The CNIB is concerned that the week is so broad in nature that it fails to address some of the unique elements that have to do with specific disabilities. There's a lot of goodwill, but it misses the mark. We withdrew our CNIB name. We were one of the 25 affiliate members. At the end of 2 years, we weren't happy. Robert Alton, CNIB, National Director of Communications.
I think where Access Awareness Week has its biggest impact is at the local level. I think the difficulty with Access Awareness Week is the focus is on attitudes, and what people who have a disability need is not for others to feel good, but to have their rights recognized. Because it's been structured from a public relations point of view, it doesn't challenge the fundamental flaws in our community. Diane Richler, Vice President, Canadian Association for Community Living. Joining me now is Kim Miller. Let's deal with John Feld's comment first. Why is Access Awareness Week not a crock?
Well, I think when you look at the sheer number of people and number of communities that are involved in the province of Ontario, that by labeling the efforts that all these, and energy that all these groups and people are putting into it as a crock is just way out of line, that just the number of people involved.
So you've heard the criticism in the quotes. How fair are they?
Well, I couldn't dispute what those people are saying. I think that all these groups have the right to say what they want to about the week, but I think it's really important that they also see the other side of it, all the people that are in support of the week.
Okay, are you aware if Access Awareness Week has gotten anyone a job, has built any more ramps, has integrated any children into school?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually those are the kinds of concrete change that we strive for with the week. The thing to remember is that the Access Awareness Week is not an end in itself, it's a means to an end, it's a vehicle to promote change. Out of this particular year, there's a new employment program that's being set up with 3 different options for people with disabilities to have work experience. The school systems are opening up. There's going to be 90 schools throughout the province of Ontario piloting the education package that was developed in conjunction with this year. Those to me are examples of the kinds of positive change that can happen through the week.
If those are the positive changes, how do you think Access Awareness Week could be improved upon then?
I think that what's got to happen is a coming together of the groups of people that are involved in working with people with disabilities and the consumer organizations themselves. The week can be best used if these people come together, and instead of focusing on all the negative things all the time, to look at how to change those negative things in a constructive way over the long term. It's not going to change overnight.
Ms. Miller, thank you.
Thank you.
The 5 theme areas of National Access Awareness Week are transportation, housing, employment, recreation, and education. Drop us a line and let us know whether or not you think Access Awareness Week has been a success in any of those areas. Have you noticed a significant change in attitudes in your community? We'll give you our number at the end of the show.
We feel that the rights and the gains that we have made are still very fragile, and that's why we're here today, because we want to, every step of the way, protect those gains and protect those rights.
That was Yvonne Peters, National Coordinator of the Canadian Disability Rights Council. She was speaking at the recent committee hearings on the Meech Lake Accord earlier this spring. Meech Lake was recently the focus of public attention once again, with the First Minister's meeting in Ottawa. Discussion of concerns about the Accord, as outlined by people with disabilities, was noticeably absent during the First Minister's Conference and media coverage of the conference. Yvonne Peters spoke to us about her reaction to the latest developments surrounding Meech.
Ms. Peters, based on the events of last week, how is the Meech deal going to affect the rights of the disabled?
Well, since the talks first began on Meech Lake, people with disabilities were looking for certainty that the Meech Lake Accord would not infringe the equality rights of people with disabilities contained in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We have always said that we are wholeheartedly in support of the distinct society of Quebec. However, we're also very concerned that a distinct society clause does not infringe the hard-won rights of people with disabilities in the Constitution. And unfortunately, I have to say that after last week's events, we're left feeling even more uncertain as to whether or not the Accord may undermine our rights.
What is at risk here then?
Well, I guess the reason that we're uncertain and the reason we see a risk is because we don't have the kind of language that says to us that the charter rights will not be undermined by the Distinct Society Clause. We also, I guess our uncertainty is heightened by the fact that we understand that there will be possible amendments looked at following the passage of the Meech Lake Accord, which will recognize the equality rights of women and which will recognize multiculturalism rights. And the fact that there needs to be that kind of amendment says to us that there might be a risk to other rights, and creates in our minds a hierarchy of rights, that some rights are more valuable than others and worthy of greater protection than others. I think there's this perception out there that if we just had greater awareness and we were just more educated about people with disabilities, there wouldn't be discrimination. So I really think that there's a lack of understanding out there as to the pervasiveness of discrimination, as to the damage that is created by inequalities. I just don't think it's seen as important. And that's where we see the danger, because when you start carving up equality rights and saying, you know, some rights are more important than others, that's where I think disadvantaged groups run the risk of, being at odds with one another. And I think it's a move on the part of the politicians sometimes to keep us separated.
Ms. Peters, thank you.
Thank you.
In the past, a company physical exam meant a pleasant session with a doctor taking your height, weight, and a brief family history. In the near future, a greater threat to employee rights could loom largely unnoticed. Called genetic screening, this new medical technology permits doctors to probe a person's genetic makeup, assess his future health, and his future. Genetic information about disabilities such as diabetes, cancer, heart disease, and AIDS can be detected. This kind of information placed in the wrong hands could affect profoundly the future of the disabled population. Joining Susan now are Jim Ray and Dr. Robert Garvin. Ray is the president of CanGene Corporation, And Dr. Garvin is the Vice President of Research and Development for Cangene, a company that specializes in biotechnology.
Mr. Ray, should we be afraid of genetic screening?
I don't think so. I mean, I think you should be enthusiastic about it because of what it offers in the future.
What is it going to offer us, Dr. Garvin?
Well, it's going to offer us information. It's going to allow medical histories to be well documented, which will allow individual choice, and it also implies individual and societal responsibility.
What if that responsibility is not taken, though, and someone is discriminated against in the workplace because they are genetically predisposed to a certain condition?
Well, let's first of all admit that is a real possibility, and we have to use all the safeguards that we have now against misuse of information. This is information just like any other, and it can be used for good or bad.
So how do we safeguard against it?
I'm not quite sure how you do it. I think it's an issue that will have to be addressed going down the road, but I think you have to separate it from the other issue, which is the benefits that accrue from the kind of testing we're talking about here. I mean, specifically, this testing is going to give you information that you can't get today, and the individual can take that information and they can use it to their own benefit.
Like what?
Well, for example, let's say someone carries a genetic marker for cancer. I would think they would want to know about it so that they can make a reasonably intelligent choice as do I smoke or do I not smoke, or do I work in an environment, you know, where there are carcinogens around. I mean, I think they're entitled to that information, and then they can make a choice around it.
How about you as two gentlemen in this business? Have you had a lot of soul searching to do?
Speaking for myself, the answer is no, because we look on it as all to the good, all useful. And with any scientific discovery, it can be used for good or bad, and we see the good side. We see it as an adjunct leading to gene therapy correction.
And I guess we've got enough faith in the process that the bad side of it will be taken care of so it does not become a factor.
Of ethical issues, I guess.
Exactly. I think morality would prevail.
So how, on the upside of things, then, how do you feel that this is most going to be helpful to an individual like myself or yourselves for the future?
It has to do with choice, individual lifestyle choice, and, for example, having children. Very, very important consideration. And it's just another piece of information. It shouldn't be necessarily deterministic, but you should know it, because responsibility is there too.
Thank you both very much.
You're welcome,
You're
Susan.
welcome.
You're watching DNet, the Disability Network. We'll be right back. Throughout history, the arts have provided a means through which people can make contact with each other. One of the performance arts that captures the imagination of many people is mime. Miko is deaf, and he works as a mime. The following report from Surrey, British Columbia, was prepared by CBC reporter Paul Heaney.
His name is Miko. When he was a child, he lost his hearing. He's a professional mime now, but this day he's performing for free.
Much more visual for the children and the movement of the body. You see, like the umbrella and the wind. They got into the children's imagination with the wind and pulling of the umbrella.
The kids here in Surrey are mostly 3, 4, or 5 years old. Many are profoundly deaf.
People will look at them. They will see a really cute child, but they will not see that this child has, is not able to communicate. And then most people will, ignore them.
But Miko doesn't ignore the kids, and the kids respond.
he can reach over that barrier and reach the children. Because he uses his body a lot of hearing people don't use their bodies. He uses a lot of facial expression, and with his makeup it adds a little bit more. I think for the children it really brings the world of art and entertainment right into their lives, and here is a deaf person who is modeling for them something that they can aspire to.
Paul Heaney, CBC News, Surrey.
Well, summer arrives officially next week. We can expect heat waves to come and go over the next few months. People with multiple sclerosis, MS, have a hard time coping with the heat. Christine Sampson has written the following commentary for DNet.
I have multiple sclerosis. I use an electric wheelchair, and since 1972, the TTC's Wheel-Trans service has been not only the better way, but the only way for me to travel around the city. Using the service since day one, I have seen or experienced many of its teething pains. Most of these symptoms have been outgrown, but one distinct problem remains. Wheel-Trans has no air conditioning to combat the hot, humid days of summer. Speaking from my own experience, the lack of air conditioning leaves me frightened and frustrated. One of the symptoms of multiple sclerosis is a low tolerance to heat. I lose control of my muscles and flop over in my chair. Breathing becomes difficult and I lose my voice, so I can't even call for help. It is a scary experience, which afterwards leaves me feeling weak for several days. The TTC has assured me that Wheel-Trans vehicles will be eventually air-conditioned, but it is unable to give a date when this will take place. The province of Ontario has approved air conditioning for provincial transit operators. Where does this leave Metro's Wheel-Trans users? When I ask for an air-conditioned Wheel-Trans bus, it is not simply a matter of comfort, but one of necessity. Without it, I am restricted to the briefest of summer journeys, and even then I undertake them with a degree of trepidation. I wonder how many regular TTC users would be willing to accept such a restriction of their independence, especially in the face of such an obvious solution. We have a good service. We deserve a better one. And only when we have a full fleet of air-conditioned buses will Wheel-Trans be the better way to travel if you are disabled and living in Toronto.
That commentary was written by Christine Sampson and read by Christine Payne.
Susan, do you have any problems because of your disability during the summer?
Yeah, actually, Joe, it was interesting to see the problems Christine ran into because they're similar to mine. I have trouble breathing, and I lose a lot of extra sodium out of my system in the summer, and I get very weak. How about yourself?
I like it hot.
Oh, yeah?
But I don't like the winter. I'm not too fussy on the cold. It sort of tightens all the joints up. So
bothers you a bit,
I'd rather have summertime all year round. You're watching DNet. We'll be right back. Well, we're still receiving a lot of feedback from viewers across the country. Keep those letters coming. They are an important part of our show. We'd like to hear about any stories you have related to transportation, Access Awareness Week, genetic screening, or any other issues that have come up in our show.
Our address is the Disability Network, CBC, Box 500, Station A, Toronto, M5W1E6. That's the Disability Network, CBC, Box 500, Station A, Toronto, M5W1E6. Our fax number is area code 416-975-5636.
We'll close off this week's show with footage from an exhibition titled People in Motion. It took place recently in Toronto and featured exhibits of technology, equipment, and services for people with disabilities. I'm Joe Coughlin.
And I'm Susan Pettit. We'll see you again next week.
What you're looking at, gentlemen, is the only aerobic fitness equipment which people in wheelchairs can use.
When the clock strikes 11, only one newscast can give you the real picture. Ona Fletcher, weeknights on the CBC.
Now hold it steady, for goodness sake.